This chapter is on economic growth. Note that my subtitle is More is Better. What is economic growth? Well, it's an increase in what we can produce. And you remember in previous chapters we talked about gross domestic product. So economic growth is really an increase in the gross domestic product. Why important? Well, it helps us fulfill more of our wants. The more we can produce, the more wants we can fulfill. Admittedly, they're unlimited, but there's a lot of difference between barely having enough to eat and being able to have enough to eat plus nice places to live and furniture and all the other things. These are not just things like cars and houses, but they're also better health care and better environment. Being able to take care of the indigent, being able to take care of people who are not able to take care of themselves. And without growth, you're not going to be able to do this. And with growth, you're going to be able to do it better. The standard of living is usually estimated by gross domestic product per capita. Well, with growth, as long as you're growing faster than the population, then the gross domestic product per person or per capita is increasing, and that means we're better off. So that means we can produce and afford more products and services. Here we introduce something called the Rule of 70, which is important to understand in terms of a lot of things, but in our particular case, it's about the growth of the economy. For instance, most of us would agree the U.S. economy can produce more today than it did 100 years ago. The next question is, so how fast is it increasing? And this has to do with something called the Rule of 70. A small point is, though, that most books will call this the Rule of 72, and why they use 70 here, I'm not terribly sure, but it really doesn't make a lot of difference. It's just that you understand this. It's based on the concept that this number divided by the percent of annual growth will tell us how fast we can double the size of the economy. So, and the reason this is true, it's not 100% divided by that percentage, but it's 70, is because we have compounded growth. And what compounded growth means is we're growing each year, but we're growing from a higher level. So for instance, you put your money at interest each year, which is the same concept. The first year you get some interest on it. The second year you get interest on your principal plus interest on the interest you accrued the year before. That's compound growth. So for instance, at a 10% return, you double your money every 7 years. At a 10% growth rate, we would double the economy every 7 years. Admittedly, though, we don't grow quite that fast. So let's use this Rule of 70 to apply it to the economy. If our economy grows at 2% per year, it will take 35 years to double the size of the economy. In other words, 70 divided by 2, the 2% growth. If the economy grows at 3%, then it will double every 23 years, 70 divided by 3. Notice that's a lot faster growth. Even though it seems like a small percentage increase, it in fact is really makes a lot of difference in how fast we can grow our economy. So economies that grow faster are able to provide more. Now, the U.S. economy grows about 3% a year on the average, but when you look in recent years at economies like China, they're growing at 10 and 11 and 12% a year. You can also see that the number of years to double declines significantly with just this 1% increase in the growth rate. For instance, if we're only growing at 1% a year, it's going to take us 70 years to double. In more recent years, the economy has not grown nearly as fast as it did in previous years. We are growing at about 2% a year instead of the 3% a year that we would normally grow over, and that's been a long-term average. So why is it important? Well, we get improved products and services. In other words, research and development is part of this growth. We're able to spend some of our income on research and developing new products and improving existing ones. We also get added leisure. That means that we're able to work fewer hours and produce the same amount as we did before. Other issues includes is that it does actually improve the environment. A lot of people, and later we're going to talk about this against growth, will suggest that, well, as you grow, is difficult for the environment to keep up, or in other words, makes the environment worse. The reality is that countries that grow usually end up using some of that growth to improve their environments. Also, as incomes grow, people demand better environmental quality. What about modern economic growth? Well, why do some countries grow faster than others? Well, there's a variety of reasons. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but it has a lot more to do with the structure of the economy and the types of laws that they have in those economies rather than the resources, as one might think it would be true, but that isn't true. In fact, countries like Switzerland and places like Hong Kong that have almost no natural resources grow extremely well, and they have grown greatly in the last several years. So why is growth distributed unevenly? Well, i.e., why does it make the distribution of income and wealth sometimes worse? Well, because not everybody shares in that growth the same. In fact, I would often argue that one of the reasons that as countries grow that we do get people get wealthier is that they see the changes coming and they take advantage of them. Many of us simply don't either see them or they actually try to fight them. The other question is, can countries catch up? And the answer partly is yes and partly no. If you're simply talking about growth rates and better quality of life, yeah, they can catch up to some extent. Countries like Japan grew more rapidly than we did, and they caught up with. They came close to catching up with us. China has as large a GDP today as we have, but there are 5 times more people. So in terms of quality of life, they still don't have the quality of life we do, but they are catching up. On the other hand, the big issue for some is which countries are innovators. We're a very innovative country. Whether that will continue, I don't know, but we have been in the past. If you're simply a country that's catching up by copying what other countries are doing, you're never going to reach the level that they are until you become the innovator. There are institutional structures that do promote growth, the biggest one being strong property rights. In a book called The Mystery of Capital by DeSoto, he did a study of the countries of the world, and his conclusion was countries that grow and do well are countries that have strong property rights. Many countries don't have the property rights the United States has, and many of those countries don't grow very well at all. At any given time, the government can come in and take your property, and therefore you don't put much effort into improving it. So strong property rights are a huge issue. Second are patents and copyrights. This is really kind of relates to property rights in a way. If you develop a new product, we're actually going to give you a monopoly on it for 17 years. Why is that? Well, you've got a huge research and development cost, and you have to get that back. Yes, that means the price for that product is going to be higher, but that is sort of the cost we pay for getting better quality products and new products. For instance, drug companies, in order to bring a drug to market, it costs them about $1 billion. And not all drugs are profitable. Those that are profitable are very profitable. We give them that monopoly for 17 years so they can recoup that $1 billion investment. What about copyrights? Well, that's intellectual property. That's books, movies, etc. And we give that to you for developing that. For instance, if you write a book, it takes a lot of time. Copyrights last a lot longer than patents. And in fact, they last beyond the death of the actual producer. So if you write a book, the rights to that book continue actually after you are dead. That's the reason in many cases, for instance, when Michael Jackson died, his estate will continue to get millions of dollars from his songs and music for years to come. That's the reason there's always these huge fights over those kinds of estates. Efficient financial institutions are important too. We have extremely efficient financial institutions in this country and in most developed countries. Imagine what happens if you don't have those, and it makes it harder to borrow money, harder to raise funds, harder to access capital. So efficient financial institutions are critical. When the Soviet Union fell, it was a communist nation. They had no stock market. The banks were pretty much run by the government, and the government politicians decided who got loans. And so they had to actually create financial institutions from scratch. And that made it extremely difficult to develop that country. In more recent years, they have done that. They have a stock market, and the economy is doing better. Literacy and widespread education. Literacy is critical. If people can't read and write, it's pretty difficult for you to grow a country. We can't give somebody a book of instructions or give them information on how to do things in writing if they can't read it. So literacy is critical, and widespread education is too. In countries, and historically, some of them have actually tried to keep the poor from becoming educated and literate. That was really to their demise. They didn't understand it at the time, but on the other hand, it was really a way to control the poor. Another is free trade. Too many people look at free trade as being a negative. They'll say, well, it costs jobs, et cetera, et cetera. But as Bastide has pointed out, most people only see the first level. What free trade does is allows us to produce higher valued goods so we can buy lower valued goods from other countries. That is a general trend as countries grow. So free trade is really critical. It also expands markets enough so that you get some economies of scale from your industries. And finally, competitive marketplaces. Competitive marketplaces allow companies to come in, produce at lower costs, undercut prices, make consumers better off. That's not the attitude in all countries, but it is still true that where you have competitive marketplaces, countries grow much better. So competitive marketplaces are quite critical to the growth of a nation. Now, they basically have three models of growth. They're all somewhat related to some extent, and they're intertwined, and you can't really have one without the other one. First of all, there are the supply factors. In other words, if you have more resources, you're going to be able to grow. You have more land, more labor, more capital, more entrepreneurial ability, your economy is going to grow. If you don't, it's going to be more difficult. But that's only one aspect of it, as we'll see in a moment. So in most cases, most countries can't acquire more land. They can't acquire more labor. That takes time, means population growth. And they can acquire more capital. That's produced. And if they train, if they educate people and teach them how to become entrepreneurs, that becomes important. The second are demand factors. Just because you can produce more, if consumers don't buy it, the economy is not going to grow. So you have to have both the fact that people are producing more, but consumers are buying more. And so that creates the equilibriums that we really saw in earlier chapters. Finally, we have the efficiency factors. Not only do you have more land, more labor, more capital, more entrepreneurial ability, you use them more efficiently. And this can come about in many ways. It can come about through technological change. It can come about because of economies of scale. As I pointed out earlier, if you simply grow your economy at the same rate as your population, you're not doing any better. In other words, the standard of living is going to be pretty much stagnant. It's not going to get worse, but it's not going to get better. But when you become more efficient, that means people get higher pay, they buy more products, and each person can produce more products than they did before, and that's important. So growth leads to a higher standard of living in most cases, and I explained what those conditions were. But as I pointed out, if the economy only grows as fast as the population, then the standard of living is not going to rise. If it grows faster than the population, then the standard of living rises. And what that means is, again, that workers are going to have to become more productive, more efficient. The faster growth is due to increased labor productivity, which leads to higher incomes. So if you have higher productivity among labor, what you're going to end up is higher wages. Now, a lot of people argue, well, it's other things such as unions, but studies have across the board shown that the only thing that really raises wages overall in a country is increased productivity. If you can produce more, you are worth more to the company. Increased productivity may mean job losses in some industries, but it frees up labor for new industries. In the 1800s, about 80% of the people in the United States were involved in agriculture. Today, it's about 3%. You might say that's bad, and in fact, it is not bad. It's actually good because it freed those people up to go work in factories and do other jobs. We weren't just worried about eating all the time. So countries where they grow, they usually find there's a huge movement of resources from the agricultural sector into the industrial, manufacturing, and commercial sector. What are the reasons for growth? Well, economies grow due to either more resources or better resources, and that's really what it comes down to. I'm going to go through these others, but all of them really amount to this. We've already talked about more resources, but we really haven't said a lot about better resources except to say that, well, workers have to become more productive. So you can grow because you have more labor, or you can grow because you have more productive labor. More productive labor is usually helps improve the standard of living more because simply people are able to produce more per given period of time. They're paid more, they live better. Second are technological advances. These are very important. Our products are better. And again, sometimes those technological advances mean losses of jobs in some industries, but again, those people will go to other industries to work. Think of all the products that we've improved over the years. The list is pretty much unlimited. I always point out that, when people say they don't make cars like they used to, my response is great. I'm glad, because cars when I grew up took a lot more care. Now they go many, many more miles. Used to, if a car had 100,000 miles on it, that would be amazing. Now it's not unusual, but it's more than that. It's a better car. It's more comfortable. It doesn't require as much maintenance. Many of the things we used to have to do to cars, we don't do it all anymore, simply because technology's improved them. Now you can actually get a unit to plug into your car that will sort of keep track of any problems that might be coming. Today, if I have a problem with my car, I take it to the auto parts store, they plug it in, and they tell me what's wrong with it. Or I take it to the dealer, and they can fix it. Admittedly, often the repairs are more costly than they used to be, but there are a lot fewer of them. The other is quantity of capital. It's not only, more capital, again, means you can produce more. And as we discussed earlier, in order to get more capital, you have to at least temporarily reduce consumption, because paying for capital comes out of savings. And countries that are poor often have extremely small amounts of capital per person. Imagine a farmer today and how much capital they have per farm. It's unbelievable. You have tractors, you have combines, you have planters, and one person probably in the 1950s, one farmer could farm about 160 acres. Now one farmer can probably farm about 2,000 acres. Why? Because they have more capital, but they also have better capital. Education and training are critical too. As we said, widespread education is important. Countries that don't grow are often countries with high levels of illiteracy, and the first thing you have to do is teach people how to read and write, and then after that you can begin to teach them other things, like how to become chemists or business people or whatever. The other is economies of scale. This is more efficient use of resources. Economies of scale simply mean if we produce on a larger scale, the cost per unit is going to go down. In other words, you really can't the auto industry is a good example of an industry with economies of scale. You really can't have an auto industry in a country that has very, very few people, or where there are very, very few cars sold. Henry Ford developed mass production, assembly line production, which made cars a lot cheaper. And so we obtained economies of scale, or again, more efficient use of resources. The other is, though, we may get better resource allocation. In other words, we may move resources from low-valued production to high-valued production. Good example is the textile industry. We really don't make many clothes in the United States anymore. Why? That's really low-valued production. Inevitably, most countries, about the first industry they will get is the textile industry, and the first industry they will lose will be the textile industry, because we need to move resources from lower valued options to higher valued options. So the people who used to maybe work in textile plants are now working in producing, manufacturing computers or automobiles, etc., because those are higher valued uses. That's how Japan developed. That's how most countries developed. They start with low valued products and then they move to high valued products For instance, I used to buy clothes made in Japan. You won't find them anymore. Why? They now make electronics and cars and everything else. So why has growth risen? But I need to sort of make a footnote here. We say, why has growth risen? Well, the point of the fact is, in recent years, our economy is not growing as fast as it was. So this might be a little bit dated in stating this, but over the last several years, instead of growing at about 3% a year, we're only growing at 2% a year. Some economists believe that's permanent. Others don't. I don't happen to believe it's permanent. I think it has to do with the structure of the economy and a lot of our regulations and taxes. But, the major point is that in past years we have seen a lot of growth in the 80s and the 90s. One of the reasons is microchips and information technology. We found that, this improves productivity greatly. Think of all the things you have today that have some kind of computer technology in them, and it's unbelievable. I always point out to students that probably your smartphone has as much computing power as many mainframe computers did way back when we first started building them. And why is it? It makes things faster. I mean, you could, a simple example, when I go to fill up my car with gas, I pay at the pump. I won't go anywhere where I can't pay at the pump. Makes things cheaper. Or faster, I shouldn't say, not cheaper. And why is that? Well, because of microchips and information technology. The other is new firms and increasing returns. Usually new firms are creating new products and giving us increasing returns to scale. And some of the things that occur because of this are, one, more specialized inputs. If you look today, we have companies that are very specialized in one product or another, and the inputs there are much more specialized too. This tends to allow more productivity and allow us to grow faster. It also allows us to spread development costs. If you're a company like GE or 3M, you produce a lot of new products, but you're so large that you can spread those development costs over many more units of output. We also get simultaneous consumption, which it means low cost to add consumers. A simple example of this are video games. Once you produce a video game, reproducing it is extremely cheap. That's the same with a lot of our software. If you type something on a computer, it's very easy to save it and reproduce it. It doesn't take much and is very low cost. The other is a network effect. I would point out we've suggested in recent years is something new. I don't think it's new. I think it's existed forever. But what do we mean by a network effect? Well, if only one person in the world had a cell phone, it would be of no value. But as we add people to that network, it becomes more and more and more valuable, and that's what we mean by the network effect. Finally, is learning by doing. This is called the learning curve. As people do things more and more and more, they get more proficient at it. There are a lot of things I've learned how to do, and the first time I do them, it takes a lot of time. The second time I do them, it takes less, and the more I do them, it takes even less time. And this can be very large. This can reduce costs by 30 to 40% or speed up production by 30 to 40 or 50% by people simply becoming faster. Many of us can imagine that. I mean, we just try to learn something, you think you're never going to learn it, it's really difficult, and eventually it gets very, very easy. For instance, one of the courses I teach is entrepreneurship, and I've done business plans for people. I'm very proficient at it. Why? I've done a lot of them. It simply makes it easier. So, what are the pros of growth? Well, I'm a big pro-growth person, so we're going to have two positions here, the pros and the cons, and as I'll point out, it's very hard for me to discuss the cons of growth. Like I said, I'm very pro-growth. Why? Well, it gives us a higher standard of living. I don't think most of us want to live the way Americans did 100 years ago. It allows people to move up the economic ladder faster. In economies that don't grow, it's very hard for people to move to higher levels of income. And we saw that a lot in the 1970s. The economy wasn't growing and people just weren't moving up. It's kind of looking like that today. Why? Because growth really creates more jobs, even though that may sound strange to you, but new industries create new jobs, and that's where most new jobs come from. We also fulfill wants better. People today who are poor in the United States have much more than poor people in other countries. In fact, they have much more than poor people used to in the United States. So the term poverty really has a much different meaning than it used to. In some countries, poverty means you don't even have enough to eat. That's rarely the situation here. And we also find, for instance, if poor people have air conditioners, they have automobiles, they have cable television. That's become the norm. Well, that simply allowed us to fulfill our wants better. Products get cheaper, allows people even with low incomes to afford them. Also, labor is more pleasant. We don't work in hot factories anymore. We often work in air-conditioned offices. For instance, one of the points I made about farming is when I grew up, farming was kind of a dirty business. You got out on a tractor and the dirt's flying all over you. Well, today you get on a tractor, except it's got a cab on it. It's probably air conditioned, and it probably has a sound system. Eventually, farmers will probably sit in their living room and do all their farming. Gives us more leisure. It wasn't all that many years ago, probably back in the 1950s, that the standard work week was 48 hours. We went to a 40-hour work week. Some industries have less than that. Why? Because we can simply produce more per person than we did before. Makes for an easier life. If you think about it, one of the reasons that people don't really need to retire anymore at 65 is because most of their jobs are a lot easier and their whole life is a lot easier. Imagine all you things you do that are done with technology or newer products. Simple example, mowing a lawn. Used to, mowing a lawn meant a real mower which was not motorized, very difficult. Now you got a power mower, and maybe even more so, you may have a power mower that you sit on. For a much easier life. It allows us to care for those that cannot care for themselves. Simple reality is we have a lot of elderly people, and without the growth in the economy, it really would not allow us to take care of a lot of those people. We also have people with health problems and they can't work. And that is true. I always jokingly talk about the Eskimo retirement plan. In that part of the world, life is very difficult, and if you can't produce, we really can't support you. So they're putting an ice floe and shoved out in the ocean. I'm sure today that that's changed simply because now I'm sure some of those Eskimos are getting assistance from the government. And it actually improves the environment. It doesn't make it worse. As we'll see in a minute, the other side says the opposite. But in countries that have high standard of living, they have better environments. We also are more energy efficient. We can produce $1 worth of GDP in this country with less energy and less pollution than any country in the world. What are the cons of growth? And as I said, I have a little problem with this because I don't see the point. To not grow is going to make things worse. For instance, one of the things I point out is has not solved all our sociological problems. You're right. But on the other hand, we've really redefined poverty. People, as I pointed out today, have much more if they're poor. Has it solved other things like mental illness? No. Is that a sociological problem? I don't know. But part of the reason that you have some of these sociological problems are not because of society, it's because of the individual too. It does not give us the good life. Well, that's kind of up. This is a situation where I can't really define the good life for you. They imply that, well, people are working harder, and I will admit that technology has allowed us to, and maybe that's not good. It really does not allow us to separate our jobs from our personal life a lot of times. People have smartphones or continuously in contact. On the other hand, some of that's self-chosen. I happen to like to work, and that's part of my good life. But it does allow us to do jobs that we like more. Is that better? I think it is. It's a strain on resources. Well, again, that may be true, but on that, I always raise the question, do we have more resources today than we did in the past? And the answer to that, I think, is an unequivocal yes. Even oil. People argue, well, there's a limited supply of oil. Maybe there is. Partly we don't really know how oil is produced. We used to say it was because of dinosaurs dying and decaying. We don't really know that that's true. There are no theories on that. But the other point is that we have more known reserves of oil in the world today than we did 100 years ago. Why is that? Because technology allows us to get stuff out of the ground that we couldn't before. We can now, through fracking, get natural gas, we can get oil that we couldn't get before. Says it creates more environmental problems. Possibly, but it also allows us to solve those problems better too. Faster use of resources tends to cause us to run out faster. Well, thing is, as resources get more expensive, we simply find resources that are cheaper. I have nothing against moving to alternative energy sources as long as they'll be more efficient and save us money. As the price of oil gets more expensive, we'll use more air power and wind power and sun power. Nuclear power is good, but I always find that people who have a problem with oil also seem to have a problem with nuclear power. Well, yeah, there are some dangers to it, but it also produces no greenhouse gases and can be extremely safe and very low cost. They say it does not lead to more leisure, but to more work and a faster pace of life. Maybe that's what we want. If you want a slower pace of life, move to a small town. That'll give you a slower pace of life. But we don't do that. We've moved to the city. So some of these, I think, are people making judgments for other people. Personally, I like growth. Do you have to partake in it? Not really. But at least it allows you the alternatives. So again, I've been somewhat biased in my discussion of the cons of growth because I have a problem with them. But I think some of these people see problems where they don't really exist. And so this chapter's been about